Hey guys, this is Ms. Arlequin, and today we're going to talk about writing a short response paragraph using text evidence. And this is also referred to as on-demand writing. So our objective for today's lesson is, by the end of the lesson, we want to be able to say that we can write a well-developed short response paragraph using text evidence. So a short response paragraph is basically a paragraph where you are answering a given question or prompt, usually no longer than one paragraph long. And so one of the first things I think we should do is look at the rubric that you are going to be graded whenever you are doing a short response. Now, this rubric is actually the New York State rubric for all short responses. It is the rubric that your short responses on your state ELA test will be graded according to. So we're going to go through it point by point. Short responses are graded on a 2-point scale. Obviously, 2 is the highest, and that is the score that we all want to aim for. So when we look at a 2-point short response, we see that to get 2 points, first, your response has to have valid inferences and/or claims from the text where required by the prompt. And so basically what that is saying is in your response, you have made some kind of claim, which is actually really simple to do. You basically just need to restate and answer the question to have a claim. And they're also looking for inferences. And we hopefully already know that when you make an inference as a reader, it's where you're making a conclusion based on text evidence and logical reasoning. So it's also sometimes called reading between the lines. You take what the author has written in the text, especially when they state something that's not clear, and you use common sense or prior knowledge to kind of figure out what the author means. So an example would be if the author said that the character slammed the door as he stormed into the room. Even though the author hasn't come right out and explicitly told you that the character is angry, you can make an inference based on the text evidence, the character's actions, slamming the door and storming, the word choice of storming into the room, and your prior knowledge that this is the type of behavior people usually have when they're feeling angry. You put those two things together to make the inference that the character is angry. If you were to include that inference into your response for a paragraph that's meant to describe how the character's feeling, then you would be accomplishing that bullet point for 2 points. Next, you have to have evidence of analysis of the text where required by the prompt. So analysis is basically just another way of talking about deep thought. It's not just saying the basic story elements, it's going a little deeper and kind of interpreting why characters are doing the things they're doing, how the author is describing or the type of writing style the author is using, how the author is showing you that the character is angry, for example. So if we use the previous example of the character storming in the room, you could say that the author is showing us through his word choice and the character's actions that this character is angry. And that would be deep thought because you're really thinking about the way the text is working and what the author is doing. The third bullet point and the fourth bullet point both have to do with text evidence. The first one is that it's relevant facts, definitions, concrete details, and or other information. So all of this right here, facts, definitions, concrete details, or other information, is just a longer way of saying text evidence. And the word relevant is very important here. They don't just want any old line thrown in there. The text evidence you use has to relate to your answer. It has to prove your answer. So if you have the correct answer, but you include text evidence that has nothing to do with your answer, you're not going to get credit for this. And the fourth bullet point says a sufficient number of facts, definitions, concrete details, or other information. A sufficient number of text evidence for a short response is usually going to be at least 2 pieces of text evidence. Most of the time, the question should tell you how much text evidence to use. If it doesn't, though, you want to always assume that you need at least 2. Keep in mind that text evidence can either be quotes, where you copy a line or a couple of lines from the text and you use quotation marks and include the page number as a citation for where the quote comes from. But it can also just be details that you paraphrase in your own words. You want to make sure that you pay attention to what the question is asking you for. If the question says that you need to cite text evidence, then you want to make sure that you use a quotation. But if it just says to use details from the story, then you can just, in your own words, paraphrase and talk about the story details. Alright, so just to review, when you are writing a two-point short response, you want to make sure that, first of all, you make a claim. So basically, you're restating and answering the question. You want to make sure that you give at least 2 pieces of evidence that prove your claim. And you want to make sure that you include deep thought. And so that deep thought can be in the form of an explanation of the evidence and how it proves your claim. Or it could be where you elaborate on the evidence with some commentary or some inferences that you have made about that evidence or inferences you've made from the text. Alright, so next we have 1 point. So because this is only a maximum score of 2 points, getting 1 point on a short response is actually only getting 50% credit or half credit. A 1 point response would be a mostly literal retelling of or recounting of events or details from the text, which basically means that you're just restating text details, you're not including any deep thought, and you're not making a claim or showing any inferences. For your text evidence, there would be some text evidence. However, it would not be the required amount, meaning if you are supposed to use 2 pieces of text evidence, you might only have included 1 piece of text evidence. And in terms of grammar and spelling, there might be incomplete sentences, or instead of writing a paragraph, you might have just listed the details using bullets. So for a checklist, a 1 point response would either be a response where you've made a claim and only gave 1 piece of evidence, or a response where you have not made a claim, but you've given 1 to 2 pieces of evidence from the text. And then finally, we have a 0 point response, which I hope to never see from any students in my class. A 0 is a response that doesn't answer any of the requirements of the question, or it's completely inaccurate, meaning whatever you wrote shows that you don't understand the question and or the reading. If you leave it blank, you obviously get a 0. If you write your response in a language other than English, you're going to get a 0. And if your response is completely unintelligible or indecipherable. So handwriting could play a part in this. If you write something that the scorer can't read, and if it's unintelligible because your English is so poor that the sentences just don't make any sense. Alright, so we've looked at this checklist for the 2 point response. Again, I wanted to show it to you one more time because this is our goal. And you want to think whenever you're writing a short response, did I include these 3 items? Because only a response that has all 3 items is going to get the 2 points.
Alright, so now how do we format our short response so we include all the elements that are necessary to get full credit? Well, I like to use the acronym RACE, and a lot of teachers actually use this acronym. Each letter stands for a certain part of your response. There are a lot of other acronyms that all basically are meaning or accomplishing the same thing. For example, I've seen some teachers use ACE, I've seen some teachers use ICE. They're all basically just shortcuts for helping you to remember the most important components to a short response. Now for RACE, the R clearly stands for restating. You start out by taking the question and then restating it so that it's no longer a question, but it's actually forming the topic sentence of your paragraph. So if, for example, you had to answer the question, who is your favorite character? You would take the question part of that question, the question word who, you delete it, and then you would just take the rest of that sentence and turn it into the opening of your paragraph. So instead of saying who is my favorite character, I cut off the who, I rearrange the verb, I move it to later in the sentence, and I say, my favorite character is. Now I can now finish that sentence with the next part of race, which is the A, answer the question. I can also have my restatement be its own sentence, and then the second sentence could answer it. It really depends on the type of question I'm answering. This one's really easy to combine the RNA together. Who is my favorite character? My favorite character is Harry Potter. Now, once I've answered the question, that's enough to get me 1 point. I now need to go for the second point to get 100% credit. I need to cite my evidence. I have to basically here prove that my answer is correct with evidence from the text. Now, your evidence should be a combination of quotes and paraphrasing. It could be just quotes. It could be just paraphrasing. Unless the question specifically tells you to cite, there is nothing wrong with paraphrasing. However, cited evidence, quoted evidence is always the strongest. Now, you basically, after you give your evidence, need to end your response with your explanation, your elaboration, or you need to extend on the evidence. And so a lot of times I'll actually start these sentences with the phrase, this shows, or this proves. There's other verbs that could work as well. This illustrates, this demonstrates. And you don't even necessarily need to use those transitional phrases, although they do help with organization. But what you're basically doing after your evidence is you're explaining how the examples connect to your answer. How are they proving that your answer is correct? You might also, depending on what the evidence is or what the question's asking for, you might need to elaborate on your evidence with an inference that you can make. So if your evidence, for example, is that the character slammed the door, but your answer is saying that the character is angry, how does slamming the door show that the character is angry? How did you know? How did you infer from that action that the character was angry? And that could be part of your explanation. Always just basically think about how does your example prove your answer. That's what you always want to make sure you do in any written response where you are including evidence. Now, the C and the E part of your response can be done in one of two ways. Sometimes it's okay to just give your 2 pieces of evidence, and that's another key you always want to think about. A short response has to have at least 2 pieces of evidence. So sometimes you might give evidence 1 and evidence 2 in 2 sequential sentences. Other times, especially if the evidence is different, if one piece of evidence, for example, comes from the beginning of the story and maybe the second comes from the end, then you're going to want to do almost like race and then another C and E. Meaning, you're going to want to restate, answer the question, give a piece of evidence and explain it, and then give a second piece of evidence and explain that second piece of evidence. So you really have to use your judgment for each particular question and the evidence that you're using. Can you just do restate, answer, 2 pieces of evidence and then explain them both in a few sentences? Or should you really break up the explanation? Should you have the evidence and explanation and then another piece of evidence and explanation? And so you'll just get better at that depending on the question and through practice.